السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا قائد الغر المحجلين وشفيع المذنبين وسيد والد آدم ولا فخر محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وأصحابه من والاه وبعد. So thank you, Sister Aram, for introducing and being with us on the broadcast, I guess we call it, tonight. And as was mentioned, this is the 5th class. We intend to go until the week right before Ramadan, so I think 8 total, and we'll see what happens after that. And also, as was mentioned so far, when we're talking about bridging the divide between religiosity or religion and spirituality, which has kind of been one of the themes we've been talking about so far, we did speak about things that were traditionally studied in the subject of theology or kalam or aqidah or usul al-din. And these usul, or these foundational aspects of what we're studying, are essential. The ulama, they have a maqula, they have a kind of a pithy saying, if you don't preserve the usul, then you'll be deprived of the wusul. من ضيع الوصول حرم الوصول. So the asl of something is that which, if it were not there, then nothing else would be present either. So the foundation. So these foundations are extremely important. And the foundation here, what we're talking about, is a foundation of our shared objective reality. There is no other reality. There is no sort of subjective post-truth sort of world, even though our culture is kind of heading in that direction. But I think as committed Muslims and as believers, we believe that the reality is the one that Allah put there, and that has not changed since He created it. Allah informs us in the Quran that He created the heavens and the earth and everything in between in 6 days. 6 days, not like our days, but days nonetheless. And then there were 2 days created, and then we did not appear, us as human beings, until after those first 2 days, when the heavens and earth and even other creatures were created, and the angels were before us, and the jinn. And it's that foundational, that primordial reality, that there's a piece of that inside each and every one of us. And some have stated that our seeking of God is nothing more than becoming reacquainted with that innermost being of ours. To reacquaint ourselves with the day of Alastu bi Rabbikum, the day when Allah said to us collectively, after all the souls were gathered in the loins of Adam, our father, alayhi salam, and Allah said to us, Alastu bi Rabbikum, qalu bala shahidna. Then we said, indeed, you are our Lord, and we have borne witness to that. So there is a part of us that still bears witness to that, every single human being. But they say the kathafa of the bashariyah, the opaque nature and the heavy nature of these bodies that we occupy can sometimes prove to be a barrier to become acquainted with that uttermost reality. So part of our life then here is contending with these particular circumstances that Allah has put us in, and it is a proving ground, it is a testing ground, it is dar bala, it is a place of trial and tribulation, and it's dar fana, and it's a place that's temporary, it's ephemeral, it's not going to be there forever. It's kind of like, you know, compared to the akhirah, it's just, you know, a temporary holding area, you know, before we go into what the Quran describes as the akhirah, the real hayawan, the real life. So our journey then in this life is to just to reach that point, which we all will reach when we die, and then all of those things that we saw as figurative and that we believed in abstract ways, or at least allegorical ways, There'll be no more allegory, there'll be no more figurative, there'll be no more metaphors. Everything will be as real can get. And that will happen when we pronounce our last breaths. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His infinite mercy and His wisdom, has equipped us with faculties, each human being, that allow us and help us to see that reality before we actually get to it, or at least to affirm that reality before we actually come upon it. And that's why He has sent messengers and He has sent prophets and He has revealed His word to us. And in His revealed word, namely the Quran, all of these things are explained to us in enough of a way for us to affirm them and to believe in them. Maybe not to completely have ihatat ilm, as mentioned, have a complete encompassing knowledge of it. And this is also to remind us of our humility and of our nature before God. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has complete encompassing knowledge of everything. وَمَا أُوتِيتُ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. And that which we have been given of knowledge is just a drop. It's not much compared to the things that can be known. So what we know and what actually can be known, there's no comparison between the two things. But the honor of the human being, sharaf al-insan, is in knowing more, in knowing to begin with, and in knowing what's true and affirming what's true and rejecting what is not. So, as we had mentioned before, we are going to also be looking at some of the, what I call the hikam, not what I call the hikam, but some of the hikam that specifically, and all of them, 264 of them have a kind of applied theology aspect to them, applied aqidah. But we're going to look at it in a thematic way, so that we look at several of them at a time and then kind of look at the running themes through them. We won't get through all of them, but we'll get, inshallah, through enough of them that we can kind of discern some of these themes. So I haven't actually approached it this way before when I've taught it. I have taught it previously just like 1 through 264, but to take a more thematic approach, and perhaps, there'll be other benefits we can get out of that. But before I get to that, I remember the last thing I think I mentioned last session, that we talked about the primal obligation of knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and knowing Him in a sense as much can be known about Him despite our limitations. And chief amongst those things that we need to know is that He exists, and that His existence is quite unlike our existence. It's not contingent, it's not dependent upon anything, it's everlasting, it's always been there, it always will be there, so forth. And so, because of the incomprehensibility of the divine essence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then reveals Himself to us in different ways. So if the essence cannot be known, then we can see things that indicate the existence of the essence. And some say that existence itself is proof enough of the divine essence. So our very existence means that there has to be a divine existence, and that those two existences are actually one and the same. Because if it were not for the divine existence, there would be no existence at all. So if not for the divine being, there would be no being to begin with. A being with a capital B. So our whole enterprise here, not just our individual existences or beings, but the whole idea of being, right, as a category with a capital B, would not be there without the being of God. And that's why some of them, they said they're actually one and the same, that God's essence and His existence are one and the same, because with a capital B, the being of God, there's no other being really worth mentioning, because all of the other beings are subsumed and understood via the true being, or the wujud al-haq, as some of them called it, the true being of God, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But how do we know Him then? How can we comprehend Him? How can we think about Him? How can we seek Him? How can we invoke Him? So one of the wonderful things that we've been given as human beings, we've been given this great gift of language, and that we use symbols that both have a printed form and also have a phonetic form that we can pronounce them. And these symbols, when put together, letters, form words, and the words form sentences, and then they give meaning. So, as the ancients said in defining the human being, al-hayawan al-natiq, or the rational animal, the Arabs said hayawan natiq, which means an-nutq, means to pronounce. So they went a bit beyond the Greeks. and said it is the animal that notches the flesh. So articulate means to share thoughts. So when we share our thoughts, that is indication that we are human beings, and the ability to share from thoughts from one to the next is an aspect of that language, but also an aspect of that language is that we are able to invoke the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Jibreel alayhi salam went to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and he said, Iqra, right, the first encounter, as it were, with Archangel Jibreel, Iqra, and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, Ma ana biqari. I am not someone who reads or recites or is well read or can articulate in that way based upon reading the thoughts of others. And then he said, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. So he said, actually showed him, well, how do you go about doing that? What is the first step? Iqra bismi rabbika. Iqra bismi rabbika. So read or recite by the name, invoking the name of your Lord. Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaqa. The one that He has created you. So invoking the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then is one of the chief principal ways by which we can become better acquainted with this ultimate reality. And so we find that lots of our ibadah, lots of our acts of worship usually include two components. We're usually saying something, or we're moving with the body. So in the prayer, for example, the harakat, or the movements of the prayer, coincide with things that we say. So the takbirat al-ihram, as we said before, you put your hands up, and it's like everything that is not from important, that is not Allah, you throw behind you, the symbolic throwing of the hands up, takbirat al-ihram, and you say Allahu Akbar. And that same meaning is conveyed in the words, Allahu Akbar, right? Allah is the greatest. And some said this is an actual superlative, or it is a figurative superlative. Because to be greater than something else means that other thing has greatness. But there's nothing that has greatness like the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they said it's a figurative superlative. So Allah is great without comparison. But in the general sense, we see that nothing can compare, nothing can be even have a whiff of comparability, except maybe we use the same words. Al-kibar, right? There's kabir, there's big, or there's great, but nothing is akbar like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allahu Akbar. So the divine names then, and the divine attributes, give us an understanding, and the utmost understanding actually, because there's no understanding above that, because we can't comprehend the essence. So it gives us an utmost understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they said there's different types of divine names before we get into the hikam. Some of them, actually two, are indicative of the divine essence. In other words, there is nothing that these two names invoke except the whole understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So not a specific attribute of God, or not a specific name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but what you can call a proper name that is shamil, right? Comprehensive of all that we understand about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as the Quran says, Surah Al-Isra, I think, قُلْ ادْعُوا اللَّهَ وَادْعُوا الرَّحْمَنَ فَإِنَّمَا تَدْعُوا فَلَهُ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. قُلْ ادْعُوا اللَّهَ أَوْ ادْعُوا الرَّحْمَنَ. So call upon Allah, or call upon Ar-Rahman, the two proper names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَإِنَّمَا تَدْعُوا فَلَهُ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. Whichever which you invoke, He has the most beautiful names. So Allah and Rahman are the nafsiyya names, or nafsiyya attributes. They indicate the divine essence. So we also say Allah when we want to refer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the most comprehensive way. Some have said that Allah is Ismullah al-Azam, that the greatest name of Allah is in fact Allah. That has been stated. We say it in the Shahada, La ilaha illallah. So the negation and then the affirmation, La ilaha illallah. And we also invoke Ar-Rahman, usually when we say the Basmala, Bismillahi Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. So these two names specifically then are indicative of the divine essence. And they, of themselves, especially Lafz al-Jalala. So when we want to refer to the name of God, we say Lafz al-Jalala. So the invocated name of magnificence can be used itself as a dhikr in itself, or as a way of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the ulama have used the verse in the Quran, قُلِ اللَّهِ ثُمَّ ذَرْهُمْ فِي خَوْضِهِمْ يَلْعَبُونَ. Say Allah, then leave them in their frivolous play. So even just to say Allah, and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, there will not come, the hour will not come upon people except there will be people saying Allah, Allah. That they will still be invoking the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Ar-Rahman also, the Arabs did not know the name of Rahman before the Prophet ﷺ. That's why they thought Ar-Rahman was a person. And they thought it was someone that the Prophet ﷺ would be going to and visiting in the mountains, and he would be the one who would be, in their imagination, telling them all these things. So that's one type of divine name, the divine name of essence, let's call it. Then there are names that are indicative of the divine tanzih, or sulub, or irreproachability is what I call it in English. So it's more like stating what Allah is not, but in stating what Allah is not, you're stating what He actually is within this name. So these names, or these attributes, then they have a counterpart that is completely the opposite, which Allah is not. So sometimes these are called sifat salbiyya, sometimes they're called negative attributes, or sometimes they're called sifat al-tanzih. Tanzih means irreproachability. Allah is beyond reproach. Or sometimes called sifat qudusiyya, holy names, min al-taqdis. And taqdis in Arabic language also means irreproachable. Much in the same way we call the haram in Mecca or haram in Medini inviolable, right? Because haram comes from haram, which means something that is inviolable, should not be, it's sacred, it should not be violated. Bayt al-Maqdis, right? So these names that are beyond reproach of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like Al-Wahid, right? Or Al-Ahad. Al-Wahid means He is one. So He's not two, He's not three, He's not four. Al-Ghani, right? Al-Ghani means the one who is completely self-sufficient and not in need of anything. So He is not Al-Faqir, right? We are fuqara. Allahu al-Ghaniyu wa antum al-fuqara. Is completely without need of anything, and everyone else is faqir, yani faqir ila afwillah wa rahmatillah wa qiyamillah iyahu wa kada. So everything else then is in need completely of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then there are names that are meaningful or positive attributes that have a meaning of themselves without understanding a negation of something else. So these would be most of the divine names, likely you could put in this category, like Al-Alim, Al-Qadir, Al-Ilm, Wal-Qudra, Wal-Murid, Al-Irada, Al-Hayy, Al-Qayyum. All of these names then indicate, right, and these names are actually can be invoked as well. Al-Qahhar, right, the one who compels or overwhelms. Al-Muqtadir, Al-Muntaqim. Al-Muqtadir, the one who is supreme in their ability to do things. Al-Muntaqim, the one who can avenge. So all of these names are indicative of, they're meaningful of positive. And some of these names are Jamali and some are Jalali. Some are beautiful names and they invoke feelings of ease and gentleness and mercy within us. And some are Jalali, which are awe-inspiring and magnificent, like the ones I just mentioned, like Al-Muqtadir or Al-Muntaqim. And some are of ease, like Al-Latif, Al-Rahman, Al-Wadud, Al-Mu'min. So these names are what called or attributes, are the positive names or the positive attributes that also help us to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And with each one of these names, we use words to describe them, and they are mentioned in the hadith of Abu Hurairah, the 99 names in Bukhari, but they're not limited to that. Some have counted over 150, and some say, not some, but the mainstream approach is that there are names that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to us and some that He did not reveal to us. So there are some that He kept within His sacred and secret knowledge, and others that He has revealed to us. And the 99 names mentioned in the hadith of Bukhari are all names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but there can actually be additional ones to that. And whether we can call upon those other names that are not specifically mentioned in the 99 names, that's a matter of fiqh. Some difference amongst the ulama, like al-Mannan, al-Hannan, Allah yamunna alaykum, right? Not mentioned specifically in that hadith, but the meaning is conveyed in the Quran. So, min al-man, right? The one who does beautiful things for you, such as that you should be grateful. Al-Mannan. So those are also names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they indicate these either meanings of majesty or meanings of beauty. And in each one of them, there's a specific ta'alluq, right? There's a specific connection to the human condition that will reveal parts of reality to you. So there is a type of, as they say, talween, right? There's a coloring of the soul that comes about when you think about these different names or you invoke these different names. And that's why some of the mashayikh that we've come across, they'll teach people to invoke certain names at certain times and in particular ways, in particular numbers. So in the realm of invocation of dhikr or of the divine name specifically, it's much like the physician, the spiritual physician can prescribe the right one for the right situation or for the right spiritual state and so forth. There are some that don't need any sort of, you don't need a prescription. You can just go and recite them. Anything mentioned in the hadith and mentioned in the Quran and so forth. Then obviously there's kind of the salawat on the Prophet ﷺ is one of those examples that has kind of a general, they said the idhn to do the salawat on the Prophet ﷺ is in the Quran. إِنَّ اللَّهَ وَمَلَائِكَتَهُ يُصَلُّونَ عَلَى النَّبِيِّ يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا صَلُّوا عَلَيْهِ وَسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, صَلُّوا عَلَيْهِ وَسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. Amr, it's a command, and it's open-ended. It's not qualified by anything. You can invoke that at any time. And actually when you are giving salawat or asking salawat, you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless your Prophet. That's basically Allahumma salli. So Allahumma, invoking Allah's name, salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Please send your blessings and your salutations upon our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then the last category are names or attributes that are indicative of divine acts. So these would be like Al-Razzaq, Al-Muhyi, Al-Mumit. Al-Razzaq, the one who gives sustenance. So where does the rizq come from? It comes from the manifestation of the divine name Al-Razzaq. Where does Ihya come from? Where does life come from? That aspect of the name that we can invoke. Al-Muhyi. Where does Imata? Where does death come from? Also from that aspect of the divine name. Al-Mumit. And so forth. And so one way of looking at the reality all around us is just what they call the tajalliyat, which are the manifestations. Here, a baby is born here. Yes. But في الحقيقة inwardly it's إماتة وإحياء. So al-Muhyi wal-Mumit. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving life here. So His divine name manifested in creation. And so life was given. Or a divine name was manifested and Mumit, life was taken away. And this person got their paycheck today. So that was Al-Razzaq. And this bird that went out in the morning and found its worm, also that's Al-Razzaq. And so by being in a state of hudur, right? Being in a state of complete immersion and recognition and shuhud and witnessing of the divine all around you, then you begin to see life in a different way. So rather than seeing these what seem to be like random, somehow uncoordinated acts all around us, and maybe even chaotic, it appears, but there's no chaos about it. It's all ordered. It's all manifestation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not a single infinitesimal, you know, nanometers worth of anything would happen were it not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that type of recognition, that type of shuhud, acknowledgement, it's not an intellectual one, because an intellectual one is fleeting. You read about it, you hear it, okay, yeah, I believe that, makes sense. But it's not something that's going to remain with you and kind of inform your world and inform your soul unless it becomes a shuhudi dhawqi, right? Something that you practice, right, to get to, and you put in a little bit of work, you know, heart work or soul work, then these things can become manifest. And basically it's implementing the sunnah and following all the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and maintaining your ibadat. I mean, that's the basic formula. There's no kind of, you know, magic wand or mystery about it, but the ability to do that is not always easy. So even when we're trying to do that, we also invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, every day when we recite 17 times, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. So إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, only you do we worship. So outwardly, all of our acts, we try to make them sincerely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ means that we seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala solely from our hearts, and we seek His aid in doing all of the other things that we are seeking. So the Fatiha really is kind of like a microcosm of how we should go about living life. Because in the beginning, we invoke Allah's name, whether we call the Basmala as from the Quran or not, but we say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Then we say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So always the best way to go about your affair in anything is to begin with gratitude. So by being grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all the other things will come out in a more beautiful way as well. So we entitled these sessions Beautiful Islam. Certainly the most important, call it a state, call it emotional response, call it what you will, but gratitude has to be at the top of the list. When you're grateful for everything and you're grateful for the little things, then the small things that you feel are irksome or you feel are out of place or you would rather not be there don't seem that important because you're overwhelmed by gratitude. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Right? Again, we're thinking about the Jamal, thinking about the beauty and the beauty of Rahmah. So Ar-Rahman, the proper name, and Ar-Rahim, which is the mercy that some have said is specific to the believer, or the mercy that is specific for the Akhirah. Maliki Yawmiddin, right? The sovereign or the owner of the Day of Judgment. So showing us this life is just fleeting, it's temporary. And then after we say Maliki Yawmiddin, we've affirmed the reality as it is. We showed that we should be grateful. Then we seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. Only you do we worship, only you do we seek assistance from. من حيث القلب. Right? إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ, especially إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, doesn't mean that Allah may not send us help in the form of people, but in terms of our connection with our souls to the divine presence, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we ask Him furthermore, إِهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. Guide us, right? Which is kind of a fara', it's a meaning of إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. So this is am and this is khas. This is general and then this is a more specific request. إِهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. And then in the way that we ask for the Sirat al-Mustaqim, we also show how we go about finding the Sirat al-Mustaqim. Sirat al-Ladina an'amta alayhim. So Sirat al-Ladina an'amta alayhim, those you have bestowed your blessing upon. So there are exemplars around us, there's others for us to follow. Sirat al-Ladina an'amta alayhim, and not fall into the pitfalls of غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ. Not the ones that you are wrathful with, or the ones who have gone astray. And the ones you are wrathful with because they have the truth, they have the manhaj, they have the methodology, but they allowed their nufus, they allowed their egos to overtake them and misguide them to a different place. And this is why the wrath is invoked. وَلَا or the dallin are those who are misguided, who don't even have the truth, who have just fallen off the way. So avoid those two pitfalls and seek help only from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this type of approach, or this type of elevated knowledge that we are talking about, requires effort, requires soulful effort, requires honestly discipline, requires temperance. It can't come about by wishful thinking. It actually requires some level of sacrifice. And on a basic level, you sacrifice those things that you may like, but they are prohibited by the Sharia. And on a more profound level, you sacrifice those things that may not be prohibited by the Sharia. They may be in and of themselves permissible, but they don't add or facilitate your way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you sacrifice that as well. And sometimes the Sharia teaches us that sometimes we have to do that. We just began the blessed month of Sha'ban, so that means a month to go before Ramadan. And Ramadan we sacrifice things that are normally halal. And it's kind of one of the lessons in that is to show us that sometimes you have to reorient the priorities. So even if you sacrifice something normally that you would be entitled to or that you'd be accustomed to, that kasr al-adat, breaking of habits, is actually one of the most important things that will bridge between religiosity and spirituality. Spirituality without discipline is destined to fail. And religiosity without grounded and inherited traditions of spirituality becomes coarse and rough and offensive. So they both need each other. Sometimes they talk about these two things like ash-sharia wal-haqiqah, right? So the sharia is the outward aspect, or the Islam of the Jibril hadith. When Jibril came to the Prophet ﷺ and asked him, tell me what Islam is, and he mentioned the 5 pillars. And then the haqiqah, right, is the ihsan, which is ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tarah, the spirituality, to worship Allah as if you see Him. So it's a modality, right? It's a kayf. It's how you go about doing it. Not what, but how. And then the bridge between those two things is the tariqah, which is iman, right? Which are the 6 pillars of faith. So affirming reality as it is. وهكذا. So this requires suluk, requires mujahada. But even in that way of sacrifice and in that way of struggling, the means themselves also are beautiful. So whether it be fasting, whether it be qiyam al-layl, waking up to pray at night, whether it be holding one's tongue when you want to say something nasty and you decide not to because it's for a greater good. And that's in terms of just outward acts. At a deeper level, it'll even be about states and thoughts, right? So you can belittle someone, or you can disparage someone outwardly by saying something about them, and you can also disparage them in your heart, right? Which is a precursor to disparaging them outwardly. Because maybe one day when you put under pressure and you are provoked, you might disparage them outwardly because the thought was already there. You already entertained it within yourself. But if you don't entertain it within yourself, and you have this level of discipline, even in terms of your inner life, let's call it, then it never even gets to the outer life. You'll never disparage that person because you never even thought about disparaging them to begin with. Because that's not the way you see them, because you have husn al-dhan, right? So you have the virtue of having a good opinion of people. And so in essence, it's like a wiqaya, it's a protection. It's like you have this rich inner life that is busy with the invocation of Allah and the hudur and the presence of everything that is manifested by the way of the names of God, that you don't have time to think about Meghan and Harry and the Queen and what happened there, went back and forth, and who's right, who's wrong, what's going to happen, how's that all going to turn out, so forth. Not that it's not insignificant, but it's not your life, right? We're so busy with other people's lives. We're passive observers. Don't be a passive observer in your own life. In our lives, we want to be active. We want to be building. We want to be helping. We want to be assisting. We want to be serving. We want to be having outward manifestations of love. But when we're passive in that sense and we're just taking things in, then what's going to come out after that? What will be the output? Right? If all that input is coming in and it's things that really don't concern us, have nothing to do with us, and are mere distractions, then what type of output can we expect after that? What type of inner life can we expect is going to be going on when that's the kind of the work we're busy with? And we said very early in this class, in the first session, I think, pay attention what you pay attention to. We have limited attention energy, right? And probably as modern people, we have much less than our predecessors. And so we don't want to kind of waste it on things that don't really bring any sort of return for us, neither in the dunya nor in the akhirah, I think. من حسن إسلام المرء تركه ما لا يعني. So from the good Islam of a person is to leave that which doesn't concern one. So, where does one start then? One way to look at it, kind of thematically or hierarchically or topically, is that usually when people want to think about rectification and changing their life around and so forth, they think about the things that they do, acts and deeds, things that they say. And one of the things that's most central to the life of a Muslim is their acts of worship. And for many, these acts of worship sometimes are transactional. Transactional in the sense that I'm going to pray now because I'm supposed to, and then, Allah wants me to do that, and that's good, but I might get some sort of return after that, right? I should get something that's, going to be an ease for me in life and so forth. Or even less than that. People may be saying, well, okay, my parents want me to pray, so I'll pray, or my parents want me to fast, so I'll fast. Then it even becomes transactional, but not even really for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the idea is for these things to be devotional, not transactional. So devotional means that they carry the true meaning within themselves, and then you're able to get the benefit that's meant for them. Because every aspect of every act of worship, there is a benefit in it. And we mentioned before, I think, a couple weeks ago about the standing in the prayer versus the prostrating versus the bowing versus the sitting versus the different movements of raising the hands. They all have spiritual implications, right? They all have effects on your spirituality, even though outwardly they just look like, coordinated movements, but those coordinated movements affect the soul. Many people believe that about yoga, for example, or Tai Chi, or Pilates, or whatever, but for us, the prayer itself is the epitome of life, right? There's standing, there's sitting, there's bowing, there's being on the ground where you came from and where you will return. And we say this is the closest you are to God when you're in the position of sujood. So all of these things carry that type of significance. So the first thing that one should be concerned with then is rectification of one's acts, one's deeds. So the hikam kind of takes that approach. It looks at kind of this transactional or habitual practice of Islam and wants to take you from that particular place into a more devotional approach, right? That will more appropriately reflect the iman. So you can also think of Islam as the outward aspect, and then iman is an inward, and ihsan is how to reconcile between the inward and the outward. And so we want our outward acts to reflect the reality of the universe. right? And the reality that it's only Allah and it's only about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's not about who sees me praying in the masjid or am I trying to get something out of it that's in terms of dunya. But that doesn't reflect the reality or our aqidah. So reconciling those two things, the actual, the ritual practice with how things actually are, is one of the, or the main objective of suluk, of tazkiyah, of purification, so forth. And I think of living a beautiful Islam, right? Islam that's just outward and movements and a laundry list of what to do and what not to do, and devoid of any deeper meaning than that is not that beautiful. It's transactional. We want to be more than transactional. We want to be devotional. So the first step, rectification of acts. And the first hikmah that Ibn Atta includes, where he says, from amongst the signs of dependence upon pious works is a diminishment of hope upon the occurrence of a misstep. From amongst the signs of dependence upon pious works is a diminishment of hope upon the occurrence of a misstep. من علامة الاعتماد على العمل نقصان الرجاء عند وجود الزلل. So here he has a couple of terms that he introduces, and one of them is i'timad, or dependence or reliance. That's an inward aspect. So he's tying an inward aspect about something to an outward aspect, which is pious works, which are outward. So there is a relationship between the two, right? And it's not just, you know, a formal transactional activity, just do it and done with and then go back to what you're doing. No, there should be not transactional aspect to it, but transformational aspect to it. You know, every act of worship should transform you to some degree, right? Like if you exercise regularly, no one would exercise regularly if they didn't think it was going to have some transformational aspect to it. Who would go to the gym and lift weights and, you know, do cardio and do all those things if they didn't think it was going to bring something transformational about them? But yet, for the prayer, we kind of just do it this habitual way sometimes, and we don't think about the transformational aspect. So here he's introducing the first step. So, and he tells us by saying, not giving us a prescription, but actually it's a description. Because he says, for amongst the signs of dependence upon pious works is a diminishment of hope upon the occurrence of a misstep. So he's also teaching us, kind of taking us out of just always looking for a command or something prescribed to us, but he's describing to us so we can recognize it ourselves. And that's actually something quite empowering in the spiritual world, right? Rather than relying upon someone else's prescription for you, but then describing what's going on with you or inside of you so that you can learn to recognize the signs yourself. So from amongst the signs of dependence upon pious works is a diminishment of hope upon the recurrence of a misstep. So it sounds negative. It sounds like we shouldn't have a dependence upon our pious works. We shouldn't have a dependence upon our ibadah and our acts of worship. Why? Because if you do, then one of the signs will be a diminishment of hope upon the occurrence of a misstep. But I thought, if we make a mistake, then we should feel bad about it. And that's true. We should feel bad about it. But what he's saying here is, if you are making it transactional, right, and you're making it a zero-sum game, such as that, oh, if I make a misstep here, then that means I am less worthy and I have less access to having hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then that means then I am looking specifically at what I do, and I'm not looking specifically at what Allah does. So he wants to take us from the I, look at what I'm doing, I made this mistake or I did this pious work, to looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what do pious people depend upon? They don't depend upon their a'mal, their works. What do they depend upon? They depend upon fadlillah. They depend upon the grace of God. So by the grace of God will their pious deeds be accepted, And only by the grace of God also will their missteps be forgiven. So it's the same in both cases. So why should I equate the two? So why should I have a diminishment of hope because I made a mistake? God's mercy is still all the same, right? Allah's mercy is still all the same. His mercy did not decrease because I made a mistake, nor did His mercy increase because I did something good. So the reason then I do the good things is because He asked me to. What they say, imtithal lil-amr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked me to do that, so then I do it. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked me to refrain from this for my own good, then I do my best to refrain from it. So this will kind of recalibrate or reorient our approach to our acts of worship, to our ibadah. That it's a privilege that you can do it to begin with. It's not a burden. Right? The Quran describes that the prayer is a burden upon everybody except al-khashi'een. Who is the khashi'ah? The one who has presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their heart. They have a witness about them, right? A witness of the divine about them. It's not burdensome to them because it's only enriching their inner life. So they're doing it outwardly, and maybe, yes, you have to make wudu, and maybe the water's cold, and maybe you have to wake up early and the time that you were sleeping and you didn't feel like doing that, but there's a recognition that there is an enrichment that comes about it. تتجافى جنوبهم عن المضاجع يدعون ربهم خوفا وطمعا. Right? Surah Al-Sajdah. تتجافى جنوبهم عن المضاجع. Their sides تتجافى. Right? It gives you a meaning like it's not comfortable being in that position. Right? Because they need to be up. يدعون ربهم خوفا وطمعا. And they invoke their Lord خوفا وطمعا. So خوفا, not من العذاب, right? Not a higher level, not from punishment. خوفا من الفراق, right? Fear of distance, of space between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وطمعا في القرب. طمعا في القرب. So not seeking the reward, but seeking closeness and nearness to the one who is worthy of being close to and near to, namely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's a whole different way of worshiping Allah, right? And this is describing the people who just can't be sleeping there all night. They have to get up and they have to, if Allah says that His mercy descends and He descends in the last third of the night and He's waiting for people to invoke Him, how possibly then can you be asleep all that time when He's just already given you the opportunity, right? So the kind of the inner workings, their inner life says, I can't live like that. I have to get up, right? And if that feeling, if that intention is there in the believer, then Allah will facilitate it for you. Allah will help you to do it. So rectification of acts then begins with looking towards Allah, not looking towards yourself. Not looking to what I am doing or how much I am doing or anything like that, but to what a privilege it is, how grateful am I to be able to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So another hikmah that's kind of also in this meaning, deeds are mere forms and their spirits are the presence of the secret of sincerity within them. Al-a'malu suratun qa'imah. Right? Deeds are mere forms. So as we said earlier, outwardly they're a form. Outwardly we pray in exactly the same way, more or less, that the Prophet ﷺ prayed and the Sahaba prayed and the companions and the people after them. I mean, physically. And maybe we even don't necessarily spend less time on prayer than they did. Yes, they did pray at long hours sometimes, but sometimes, they had other things to do. So what's the difference then? So it's not the surah, right? It's not the form outwardly, but it's the spirit. وَأَرْوَحُهَا سِرُّ أَرْوَحُهَا وُجُودُ السِّرِّ الْإِخْلَاصِ فيها. And the spirit behind the form, or the spirit that gives life to the form, is the presence, wujud, of the secret of sincerity. Right? In Arabic he calls it sirr al-ikhlas, within them. The secret of sincerity. Some of them said, the commentators on this said, why did he could have just said sincerity. Why did he say secret of sincerity? Are they not the same thing? Isn't the secret to ibadah, secret to acts of worship, to be sincere? So why the secret of sincerity? Some of them said sincerity is tafreed al-ikhlas or tafreed al-niyya lillah. So sincerity is to invoke only Allah, to seek only Allah in your acts of worship. Amma sir, right? The secret in that, التبري من الحول والقوة. حول وقوتك. التبري من الحول والقوة. So to declare oneself free from the blemish of thinking they have their own independent power and strength. So again, it's moving from the I. So the sir then, even in your acts of worship, even though physically you may be doing them, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing them. He's allowing you to do them, and He is blessing you by allowing you to do them. وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. It was not you who threw the arrows, when you threw the arrows, but it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that was a supreme act of a divine act of worship when the archers threw their arrows at the enemy. So is the prayer not the same? So when you prayed, you did pray outwardly, but the one who gave you the hawl and the quwwah, the power and the strength and the ability and the success and the tawfiq to do it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now you'll pray and now you will invoke Allah out of gratitude, right? Which is one of the higher forms of invoking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This was the prophetic form. When he was asked, why do you pray so long by Aisha and your ankles or your calves are swelling? He said, أَفَلَا أَكُونَ عَبْدًا شَكُورًا. Should I not be a grateful servant? So out of gratitude, not out of any transaction. So, and if you think about the things we have to be most grateful for, the basic gratitude, that we're actually here. That we actually exist. And that we actually continue to exist. So they said, نعمتان نعمة الإيجاد ونعمة الإمداد. The blessing of existence and the blessing of continued, sustained existence until the time that Allah decrees. Every single creature on the face of the planet has these two things to be grateful for. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala هو القدير وهو المقتدر وهو المريد. So everything He does is with a purpose, and it's by choice. So He could have chosen and could have made purposeful someone besides you and someone besides me in a whole different world than this world. He could have made Mars the inhabited planet, and the earth, nobody's on it. But that's not the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He made this particular planet, this particular place, these particular people. So all of those things are choices made by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so we should be at least grateful for that choice that He chose us. And that's an honor. Allah honors us by choosing us to exist. And so we try to honor Him by showing our gratitude for that honor He bestowed upon us. So I think we're upon the hour, so I'm going to stop here.